Jaden Foster had moved to Pine Hollow to escape the noise of the city, not to start a neighborhood war. The town, wrapped in rolling hills and tall pine trees, had promised him peace, a place where nights were quiet and the air smelled of rain and sap. After years of working as an environmental engineer in a downtown office, he wanted nothing more than a slice of silence and sky. His new house, a single-story home with a wide porch and a fire pit he'd built himself, felt like the first real home he'd ever owned. He spent his evenings out there, watching the sun fall behind the trees, his dog curled beside him, the world reduced to wind, smoke, and the soft crackle of the fire. That small fire pit, nothing more than a circle of stone, would soon ignite something far larger than he could have imagined. The trouble began on an early autumn evening. The air was cool, the sky copper with sunset, and Jaden had invited two close friends over for a simple night outdoors. They grilled vegetables, played quiet music, and talked about everything but work. Jaden had checked all the safety rules beforehand. His permit for open flames was up to date. The fire ring was properly distanced from the fence line, and he even had a hose and extinguisher nearby. It was all harmless, even wholesome. But to one pair of eyes watching from across the street, it was a personal affront. Margaret Waters, president of the local HOA and self-proclaimed guardian of neighborhood order, stood on her porch, clutching her phone like a badge of authority. To her, the faint ribbon of smoke rising from Jaden's yard was not a simple campfire. It was defiance, a violation, a challenge to her control. She called the sheriff before Jaden had even poured the first glass of wine. When the flashing lights arrived, Jaden's friends fell silent, unsure whether to laugh or be nervous. The sheriff, a middle-aged man with a weary voice, stepped out of his cruiser and asked if there had been a complaint about an illegal burn. Jaden, polite but confused, showed his paperwork, explaining that his permit was valid, that he'd followed every guideline. The sheriff nodded slowly, clearly seeing nothing wrong, but protocol demanded he radioed the fire marshal anyway. Margaret watched the exchange from her lawn, her arms crossed and chin raised as if she were orchestrating justice. "He's been burning things for hours," she declared when the marshal arrived, "and the smoke's drifting into our homes. He could start a wildfire." The marshal, a woman named Perez, inspected the fire, the pit, and the permit with methodical calm. Her expression didn't shift until she reached the line on the permit where the date was printed. "Everything's current," she said flatly. Margaret's voice rose indignant, as though reality itself had betrayed her. "That can't be right. I'll be filing a complaint with the HOA." Perez gave her a thin smile. "Ma'am, you can file whatever you want, but this property is fully compliant. In fact," she glanced around the street at the rows of identical beige houses behind manicured lawns. "When's the last time this block was inspected for fire safety?" Margaret blinked, thrown off balance for the first time. "It's always maintained properly. We follow all community standards." But Perez wasn't listening to excuses. She was looking at the faded hydrant down the street, the rust streaking its base, the dead grass encircling it. "I'll need to check your HOA's inspection records," she said. "Hydrant caps shouldn't look like that. Those lines might not even be pressurized." Margaret's composure wavered, her smile tightening. Jaden stood quietly by his extinguished fire, unsure whether to intervene or just let the chaos unfold. He could feel the tension shift, the power balance flipping in slow motion. Perez radioed her department, requesting a cross-check of safety permits for the entire subdivision. Within minutes, she received confirmation that no valid inspection records had been filed in over 6 years. The hydrants, sprinkler systems, and emergency exits for the HOA clubhouse were all expired. A low murmur rippled through the gathered neighbors who had stepped out to watch the spectacle. Margaret's face went pale as Perez explained that such violations carried steep penalties and immediate corrective action. "Every home on this street," the marshal said, "is technically out of compliance. If there's a fire, none of your systems would function. I'm obligated to report this to the county." Jaden exhaled slowly, the absurdity of it settling in. He had done everything right, yet it was his accuser who stood exposed under the harsh light of accountability. As the fire trucks rolled away and the sheriff closed his report, the neighbors began whispering among themselves, their once loyal HOA president shrinking under the weight of their stares. That night the air in Pine Hollow was colder than usual, the scent of smoke lingering longer than it should have. Jaden sat alone by the darkened pit, the embers gone to ash, wondering how one harmless fire had turned into the spark that would burn through the heart of an entire community. By the following morning, the story of the illegal Campfire incident had already started circulating across Pine Hollow. What had begun as a petty neighborhood dispute was turning into something that neither Jaden nor Margaret Waters could contain. The fire marshal's brief inspection, which at first seemed like a minor inconvenience, had triggered a full departmental review. Before noon, 2 county fire safety vehicles were parked at the entrance to the subdivision, and officials were walking house to house, clipboards in hand. Jaden watched from his porch as neighbors stepped outside, frowning at the sudden intrusion, while Margaret stood at the end of the cul-de-sac, trying in vain to reassert control. She was dressed impeccably, as always, in a pressed blazer and pearl earrings, but the strain around her mouth betrayed panic. She had called the authorities, hoping to humiliate Jaden in front of the community. Now the spotlight had turned squarely on her. The fire marshal's office discovered quickly that the HOA's official inspection files were incomplete, and many of the most critical documents had been temporarily misplaced. The hydrants on 3 streets were rusted shut. Fire alarms in the clubhouse were disconnected, and several residents' sprinkler systems had been capped off years ago to save on maintenance costs. The violations stacked up faster than anyone could process them. When the lead investigator, Captain Perez, returned to the HOA office to request the latest compliance reports, she found nothing but binders filled with outdated forms and self-signed inspection sheets that hadn't been verified by the county. Noah Cobell, Otia, nearly a decade. Jaden didn't take pleasure in watching it unravel, but he couldn't help the grim sense of justice that settled in his chest. For months, since he'd moved to Pine Hollow, he'd noticed the rigid way Margaret and her allies enforced the HOA's rules. They fined people for the color of their mailboxes, for leaving recycling bins out too long, even for planting unauthorized vegetation. Yet when it came to their own responsibilities, they'd apparently chosen shortcuts and silence. Now the hypocrisy was cracking open in public view. By noon, local news vans had appeared, alerted by a whisper from someone inside the county office. Reporters in windbreakers lingered near the entrance, filming the line of fire department vehicles and the growing crowd of uneasy residents. Margaret attempted to stage manage the situation, insisting to anyone who would listen that this was all a misunderstanding, that the documentation was being updated, and that a few outdated permits didn't mean the neighborhood was unsafe. But Captain Perez wasn't interested in optics. She had authority, and she used it decisively. A stop work order was placed on all HOA-managed facilities pending compliance verification. The clubhouse, pool, and playground were sealed off with bright orange tape. A thick packet of citations, each with its own fine, was delivered to the HOA office. The preliminary total approached $800,000 in penalties, and that was before the cost of bringing everything back up to code. That evening, Jaden received a formal apology from the sheriff's office for the unnecessary disruption at his property. The deputy who had responded to Margaret's call stopped by personally, shaking his head as he explained how the situation had escalated. "She's been calling us for years," he admitted quietly. "Every time someone so much as parks a truck in front of her house. We usually let it go, but this time, well, Looks like it backfired. Jaden thanked him, still feeling a strange mix of amusement and exhaustion. He had wanted peace when he moved here, not notoriety. Yet peace, it seemed, was impossible when control and ego ran deeper than reason. Across the street, lights still burned late into the night at Margaret's house. People were coming and going, board members, lawyers, even her husband, who normally kept to himself, pacing on the porch with his phone pressed to his ear. Their pristine lawn, once the pride of the block, was now littered with boxes of disorganized files as if the entire HOA was being exercised, one document at a time. Jaden sat by his window, listening to the faint hum of distant generators as the inspection teams worked into the night, photographing hydrants, testing alarms, taking water samples. The air smelled faintly metallic, a mix of rust and cold pine, and the neighborhood was quieter than he had ever known it to be. 2 days later, a formal report was issued. It confirmed every suspicion. The HOA had neglected mandatory fire safety renewals for at least 6 years. The last inspection request had been submitted, but Margaret had marked it as completed herself to avoid paying the city fee. Worse, funds collected from residents for infrastructure maintenance had been redirected toward cosmetic upgrades, paint jobs, landscaping, even the decorative fountain at the neighborhood entrance that no one had wanted, but everyone had been charged for. The total misuse of funds was staggering. The HOA emergency meeting was called that same night, held at the sealed clubhouse parking lot because the interior had been deemed unsafe. Jaden attended only because Perez herself asked him to, explaining that he was technically the origin point of the incident, and that his statement might be required. What he witnessed there felt like theater, the fall of a tiny kingdom. Margaret tried to maintain her composure, reading from prepared notes about temporary procedural oversights, but the crowd wasn't buying it. Her vice president interrupted her, accusing her of hiding information. One resident shouted that his insurance premiums had skyrocketed because of the HOA's negligence. Another woman broke into tears, saying she'd trusted Margaret to keep their community safe. When Perez arrived, clipboard in hand, she addressed the crowd directly. "This isn't a small matter," she said, her tone professional but firm. "If there had been a fire, most of your hydrants wouldn't have worked. Several of your emergency exits are blocked, and the HOA failed to report structural damage in 2 properties along Pine Ridge Drive. These aren't technicalities. These are life-threatening violations." Her words landed like thunder. Margaret stood frozen, her face drained of color. Jaden caught her eyes briefly, and in that instant, the arrogance that had fueled every HOA notice and warning letter was gone. What replaced it was fear. The news that followed spread faster than any wildfire ever could. Pine Hollow was suddenly the headline in the regional papers. HOA faces $800,000 fine for negligence after residents' false complaint. Cameras showed aerial shots of the community, its uniform houses lined up like dominoes waiting to fall. Neighbors who once whispered behind curtains now posted public statements condemning the HOA board. Former members came forward with stories of intimidation and manipulation. The clean, idyllic image of Pine Hollow crumbled almost overnight, replaced by suspicion, resentment, and lawsuits waiting to happen. Through it all, Jaden tried to stay detached, but it wasn't easy. He found anonymous letters left in his mailbox calling him a troublemaker and fire starter. Someone slashed his garden hose one night, and another neighbor reported seeing Margaret's car idling near his driveway in the early morning hours. The irony wasn't lost on him. The woman who had called the sheriff to accuse him of being unsafe was now the one breaking laws to protect her crumbling reputation. What she didn't realize was that the truth had already spread too far to bury. The county had initiated a full audit of the HOA's finances, and federal regulators were now involved. There was no going back to the quiet life Pine Hollow once pretended to have. By the end of the week, Jaden's name had become shorthand in the local news for unintended justice, though he hadn't sought it. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now stopped to thank him in passing. The fire pit that had started everything sat cold and empty in his yard, but its presence carried a strange symbolism. It wasn't destruction that it represented anymore, it was exposure. And beneath the surface of the neatly mowed lawns and freshly painted fences, Pine Hollow had been burning for years. Jaden had merely been the one to light the match that made the truth visible. The following weeks turned Pine Hollow into a quiet battlefield, a place where smiles became masks and every polite greeting carried the weight of accusation. Jaden could feel the shift each time he walked his dog past the neat row of houses. Blinds twitched, whispers followed, and the neighbors who once nodded at him now turned away as if afraid that simple acknowledgement might implicate them. Margaret Waters had not resigned from her position as HOA president, despite the fire marshal's findings. Instead, she doubled down, presenting herself as a victim of slander and claiming that Jaden had orchestrated the entire scandal to destroy the reputation of a well-run community. The brazenness of her reinvention stunned him at first, but soon it became clear that denial was her only defense. She started sending mass emails to residents, accusing him of fabricating evidence, even implying that he had bribed the fire marshal to stage the investigation. Jaden knew it was absurd, but rumors were a kind of fire too. They spread fast and consumed reason as easily as dry wood. The HOA meetings that followed were spectacles of tension. Margaret presided over them like a queen clinging to a collapsing throne, her voice brittle with self-righteousness as she accused county inspectors of corruption and hinted that outsiders were trying to devalue the neighborhood. Jaden attended one such meeting out of a sense of duty rather than curiosity, and the moment he entered, the air grew taut. Conversations fell silent, and a few residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Margaret, seated at the head of the table, smiled without warmth and gestured toward him with exaggerated politeness. "Ah, Mr. Foster," she said, "our newest activist. Perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts on fire safety, since you seem to know so much about it." Her tone was honeyed poison. Jaden met her gaze and calmly replied that transparency would solve more problems than propaganda, but the words barely mattered. The crowd had already chosen sides, and for many, fear was louder than truth. Outside the meetings, the hostility grew subtler and more invasive. Someone sprayed his fence with the words, "Go back," in red paint. Another night, garbage was dumped across his lawn. When he filed a report, the deputy who arrived shook his head sympathetically but said there was little they could do without witnesses. Jaden began checking his security cameras each morning, uneasy but not intimidated. He knew the harassment wasn't random. It was organized, likely by a handful of HOA loyalists who believed they were defending their community from an intruder. He could almost admire their blind devotion if it weren't so pathetic. Meanwhile, the county investigation deepened. Perez and her team discovered inconsistencies in the HOA's financial records. Maintenance funds that didn't match expenditure logs, unaccounted transfers to consulting firms that didn't exist, invoices with forged signatures. It was enough to warrant a criminal audit. The news of potential fraud sent ripples through Pine Hollow, and suddenly Margaret's narrative began to crack. A few residents quietly reached out to Jaden, apologizing for their earlier hostility and offering to testify about how the HOA had bullied them into silence over the years. One woman confessed that she had been fined nearly $2,000 for painting her fence an unapproved shade of cream, while another admitted that she'd been pressured into donating money to a beautification fund that never resulted in any visible improvements. Jaden listened, taking notes, realizing that what he had stumbled into was far larger than one act of bureaucratic negligence. It was a small-town empire built on manipulation and fear. Yet for every person who spoke up, 2 more retreated into silence, unwilling to risk Margaret's wrath. She continued to hold informal gatherings at her house, inviting select neighbors for what she called community restoration discussions. Jaden knew they were strategy meetings, sessions to rebuild her influence, to cast him as the outsider who had come to ruin their perfect neighborhood. Flyers began appearing in mailboxes accusing him of defaming property values and endangering community stability. The language was almost comical in its melodrama, but its effect was real. Businesses around town that once welcomed him now served him with stiff politeness. Even the hardware store clerk, who used to chat with him about weekend projects, began to look uneasy when Jaden came in. Reputation in small towns was fragile, and Margaret was expert at weaponizing it. One afternoon, a black SUV rolled to a stop in front of his house. 2 men in dark suits stepped out, identifying themselves as representatives from the HOA's legal department. They handed Jaden an official notice accusing him of public defamation and community interference, threatening civil action if he did not issue a formal written apology and retract his statements to the media. Jaden read the document carefully, his anger rising with each absurd accusation. It was filled with vague legal jargon but devoid of substance, an intimidation tactic masquerading as law. He thanked the men for their delivery, tore the notice in half, and let the pieces fall onto the gravel driveway. "Tell Mrs. Waters she's welcome to sue me," he said evenly, "but she should save her money for the fines she already owes." That night, while he sat by the window with a cup of cold coffee, Jaden saw the SUV pass by again, slowing just enough for its headlights to sweep across his yard. It wasn't paranoia. It was surveillance. He'd seen the same tactics during his years working with corporate compliance investigations, pressure through visibility, intimidation through repetition. It meant they were scared, which only strengthened his resolve. Still, the strain was beginning to wear on him. The peace he had sought in Pine Hollow had turned into sleepless nights and constant vigilance. The sound of every car door made him glance toward the window. Even his dog had grown restless, pacing the porch whenever footsteps echoed too close to the gate. The first escalation was not marked by a single explosion of conflict, but by a slow tightening of the noose, a series of small acts designed to suffocate him into silence. Yet Jaden refused to yield. He began documenting everything, saving copies of letters, recording phone calls, collecting testimonies from residents who were ready to speak out. He met quietly with Perez and a county attorney who hinted that criminal charges against the HOA board were now a strong possibility. The thought should have brought satisfaction, but instead it filled him with unease. He knew how people like Margaret reacted when cornered. They didn't surrender, they retaliated. His prediction proved right when, one gray morning, he found a notice pinned to his door with a single rusted nail. It wasn't from the HOA, but from the county court. A summons indicating that the association had filed a defamation suit against him. Margaret had gone through with her threat. The irony was almost poetic. She had spent years evading the law, yet now she was running straight into it, convinced that she could still manipulate the system as easily as she had manipulated her neighbors. Jaden folded the paper and set it on the counter, staring at it for a long time. The storm had only begun, but he was no longer afraid of it. Later that evening, the sky turned a bruised violet as a storm rolled in from the west. Thunder rumbled over the pine ridge, and rain began to fall in slow, heavy drops that tapped against the windows like impatient fingers. Jaden stepped outside, standing on the porch as lightning illuminated the street. Across the road, the lights in Margaret's house flickered, then went out. For a fleeting second, He thought of the fire hydrant still under repair, the safety system still offline because of her negligence. She had built her empire on control, but now she was trapped inside the ruins of her own creation. As the rain intensified, Jaden let the cold water soak through his shirt, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over him. There was no turning back anymore. Whatever came next, he would face it head-on. Pine Hollow had drawn its battle lines, and he was done retreating. The defamation suit should have silenced him, but it had the opposite effect. The day Jaden's case number appeared in the public record, a local journalist named Leah Thompson called him, asking for a comment. She had been following the HOA scandal since the fire marshal's initial inspection and smelled something larger beneath the surface. Embezzlement, negligence, maybe even collusion with city officials. Jaden hesitated at first. He had no desire to turn his life into a headline. Yet the more he thought about it, the more he realized that staying quiet would only feed Margaret's narrative. If the truth was going to survive, it had to be spoken loudly. So he agreed to meet her at a small cafe outside town, far from the whispering streets of Pine Hollow. Leah arrived with a notepad, a recorder, and that sharp, hungry look that only seasoned reporters carried. She asked questions with precision, listening without judgment as Jaden recounted everything. The campfire, the sheriff's visit, the discovery of the expired safety permits, and the retaliation that followed. Her eyes widened when he described the missing maintenance funds and the falsified inspection reports. When the interview ended, she promised him discretion, but Jaden knew it was only a matter of time before the story reached daylight. 2 weeks later, the feature ran under the headline, Sabu, the fire that exposed a neighborhood, inside Pine Hollow's $800,000 scandal. It was detailed, well-sourced, and damning. Leah had dug deep, cross-referencing county records with HOA financial statements and even uncovering emails between Margaret and a contractor who admitted to adjusting inspection forms for a small cash bonus. The article painted Jaden not as an agitator, but as the accidental whistleblower who had stumbled upon years of quiet corruption. Overnight, the balance of sympathy shifted. Reporters started calling for comment, television crews parked near the subdivision's entrance, and residents who once treated Jaden as a pariah began leaving thank-you notes in his mailbox. Yet victory came with its own poison. The same exposure that vindicated him also destroyed whatever remained of his anonymity. Every trip to the grocery store, every walk with his dog, was now accompanied by curious stares and murmured recognition. Margaret's reaction was as explosive as it was predictable. At the next HOA meeting, she arrived flanked by 2 lawyers and a printed copy of the article, waving it like a flag of betrayal. Her speech, a rambling blend of outrage and self-pity, accused Jaden and the media of conspiring to dismantle community governance. She insisted that the missing funds were part of a long-term infrastructure reserve plan and that any discrepancies were due to accounting transitions. It was a performance for the faithful few who still believed in her authority. But the room had changed. The energy that once bent toward her now resisted. People whispered, exchanged glances, and for the first time interrupted her without fear. One resident, a quiet man named Harold, stood up and demanded to see the HOA's original financial statements. Margaret stammered, claiming confidentiality. Harold laughed bitterly. "You took our money," he said. "We have a right to know where it went." By the following week, the county's audit team began its official inquiry, setting up in a temporary trailer near the entrance to Pine Hollow. Boxes of records were seized from the HOA office. Inspectors questioned residents, contractors, and even local fire officials. The number of irregularities ballooned beyond anyone's expectations. What began as a few missing documents turned into a full-blown investigation into fraud, negligence, and obstruction. The state fire marshal's department added its own charges after discovering that Margaret's board had actively falsified compliance updates to avoid paying annual renewal fees. Every new revelation struck another blow to her crumbling empire, yet somehow she refused to step down. Jaden tried to stay out of the spotlight, but it was impossible. Leah returned for a follow-up interview, this time filming for a television segment. Cameras captured him standing near his now famous fire pit, explaining calmly that he had never wanted any of this, that he simply believed accountability should apply to everyone. The clip went viral on social media, shared by local watchdog groups and homeowners across the country who saw their own frustrations reflected in his story. Strangers sent him letters, calling him brave, but bravery wasn't what Jaden felt. It was exhaustion. Every compliment reminded him of the chaos that had consumed his once quiet life. Then came the retaliation in earnest. Margaret's allies flooded the HOA website with posts labeling him a liar, a narcissist, a plant sent by developers to ruin property values. One anonymous email warned him to watch his back and ended with a blurry photo of his house taken at night. Jaden forwarded it to the sheriff's office, but he didn't expect much. In Pine Hollow, law enforcement was as wary of crossing the HOA as anyone else. The sense of isolation grew heavier with each passing day. He began keeping his lights on at night, not out of paranoia, but practicality. He had learned that power often fought dirtiest when cornered. What neither Jaden nor anyone else realized was that Margaret's desperation was about to open a new front. She hired a crisis consultant, an ex-lawyer named Thomas Reed, whose specialty was manipulating public opinion. Reed started a campaign of selective truth. Yes, the permits had lapsed, but that was due to clerical delays. Yes, funds were mismanaged, but only because external contractors failed to deliver. Yes, fines had been issued, but the county overstepped. He gave interviews to sympathetic outlets, portraying Margaret as the victim of a smear orchestrated by overzealous officials and an ambitious reporter. It worked better than Jaden expected. For every person who saw through the spin, another began to doubt what they'd read. The narrative was shifting again, not toward innocence, but toward confusion. Meanwhile, the audit uncovered something that changed everything, a series of hidden payments made to a private developer. The transfers were small enough individually to avoid notice, but together totaled more than $200,000. The developer, when contacted, claimed the money was for early property rights negotiations. It appeared that Margaret and her board had been planning to sell portions of the community's greenbelt to commercial buyers under the guise of land improvement projects. The betrayal cut deep. Those wooded areas were what had drawn many residents to Pine Hollow in the first place, the last patches of nature amid the sprawl. Leah published the findings in a second exposé titled The Price of Silence: How HOA Greed Threatened Pine Hollow's Future. Public outrage followed. Margaret's email was flooded with resignations from board members. Neighbors who once avoided Jaden now came to him for advice, asking how to protect their properties from being absorbed into the mess. Yet amid the chaos, Jaden found no satisfaction. He had revealed the truth, but the truth had devoured everything peaceful in his life. One night, sitting on the porch under a sky heavy with the smell of distant rain, he admitted to himself that he felt no triumph, only fatigue. The fight had taken on a life of its own, one that didn't need him anymore. Still, there was no stepping away, not when Margaret was still out there, cornered and dangerous. The turning point came when the fire marshal's department returned to conduct a follow-up inspection. This time, the visit wasn't about paperwork. It was about physical safety. The inspectors discovered that the water pressure in the main hydrant line was critically low, likely due to years of neglect. If a fire had broken out anywhere in Pine Hollow during that period, The hydrants would have been useless. The county immediately shut down water access to the clubhouse and several nearby properties until emergency repairs could be completed. Residents were furious, gathering in front of the HOA office demanding answers. Margaret tried to appear calm, but the panic in her eyes betrayed her. Someone shouted that she should be arrested, and another yelled for her to refund every dollar she had stolen. The mob mentality spread quickly, and for the first time, Jaden felt a flicker of fear, not for himself, but for what collective anger could become. Perez intervened before the crowd could turn violent. Standing atop the HOA steps, she addressed everyone through a loudspeaker, confirming that charges were pending and that the board would be suspended indefinitely. It was the first public acknowledgement that criminal prosecution was inevitable. Margaret stood nearby, trembling but trying to hold her composure. Her voice broke when she tried to argue, insisting that she had done everything for the good of the community. No one believed her anymore. Jaden watched from the edge of the crowd as she was escorted back inside the office by 2 deputies for questioning. It was over in a practical sense, but emotionally, Pine Hollow was still burning. That evening, as dusk settled, Jaden walked the length of the street that had once been so picture-perfect. Lawns were unkempt, mailboxes dented, for sale signs sprouting like weeds. The illusion of control was gone, and in its place stood something raw and uncertain. The neighbors he passed no longer looked like enemies or allies, just people caught in the wreckage of misplaced trust. He realized then that the real fire wasn't the one he'd lit that night months ago. It was the slow, invisible one that had been eating through Pine Hollow for years, fueled by greed, pride, and silence. He had only brought it into view, and though he could already sense the storm of trials and hearings ahead, he knew the story had reached its turning point. The mask had been torn away, and there was no hiding the flames anymore. In the weeks that followed the public collapse of the HOA board, Pine Hollow felt like a wound left open to the air, raw and exposed. The media trucks had left, the reporters had moved on to fresher scandals, but the aftermath remained, heavy and unresolved. Margaret Waters was still technically free, though her position as president had been suspended pending legal proceedings. Most of her former allies had resigned or vanished into silence, yet somehow she refused to disappear. Her house, once the epitome of suburban pride with its perfect hedges and spotless driveway, had become a fortress of drawn curtains and whispered visits from lawyers. For the rest of the neighborhood, life teetered between uneasy calm and quiet dread, as though everyone were waiting for another blow. Jaden tried to focus on reclaiming some semblance of normalcy, repairing his garden, walking his dog, pretending not to notice how many eyes still followed him when he passed. But beneath the surface of that silence, something was shifting again, darker and more deliberate. It began with the letters, neatly folded sheets of paper left in mailboxes late at night, unsigned but printed on high-quality stationery that everyone recognized as the HOA's old letterhead. Each one carried the same message, slight variations in phrasing but identical in intent. Do not trust the county. The fines are fraudulent. The truth will come out. At first, residents dismissed them as Margaret's desperate attempt to save face, but the letters kept coming, growing bolder, spreading accusations that the fire marshal's office and the county inspector had accepted bribes from Jaden and Leah Thompson to manufacture the scandal. Some neighbors even started to believe it, whispering that maybe the whole investigation had been a setup to drive property values down so developers could swoop in and buy cheap land. Jaden tried to ignore the talk, but it began to poison every conversation. The community that had briefly united against corruption was fracturing again, split between those who wanted closure and those who clung to conspiracy. Then came the lawsuits. Margaret filed not one but 3 separate complaints. One against the county for defamation and financial damage, another against Leah's publication for emotional distress, and a third directly against Jaden for incitement and targeted harassment. Her attorney, the same Thomas Reed who had masterminded her earlier smear campaign, framed it as a fight for justice. He gave interviews claiming that Margaret was the real victim, that she had been vilified by a manipulative newcomer and railroaded by corrupt officials. It was astonishing how skillfully he twisted the narrative, reducing months of evidence and eyewitness accounts to a story of a misunderstood woman destroyed by gossip. Jaden's lawyer advised him to remain silent and let the courts handle it. But silence was difficult when his name was plastered across social media, alongside doctored photos and half-truths. The tension reached a breaking point when Perez, the fire marshal who had led the original inspection, received an anonymous threat. Someone left a dead bird on her windshield outside the county office with a note scrawled in black marker. "Keep your hands off Pine Hollow." The local news picked up the story, reigniting the scandal and drawing attention back to Jaden, who found himself once again in the middle of a storm he hadn't created. Reporters returned, cameras flashing, neighbors whispering. Perez visited him one evening after dark, parking her unmarked car down the street so as not to draw attention. She looked tired, her uniform rumpled, her eyes bloodshot. "You need to be careful," she told him quietly. "This isn't just an HOA dispute anymore. We've traced some of the payments Margaret made, and it looks like she was funneling money to private investigators. You're being watched, Mr. Foster." Jaden felt a chill crawl up his spine. He'd suspected surveillance before, but hearing it confirmed from Perez made it real. He began noticing small details he'd ignored before. The unfamiliar car parked 2 houses down for hours, the faint click on his phone line, the drone that buzzed over his backyard one afternoon before vanishing behind the trees. It was harassment masked as observation, a slow psychological erosion meant to make him doubt his safety. He refused to play the victim, though. Instead, he began keeping a meticulous record of every incident, logging times, dates, and photos. When he showed the list to his attorney, the man exhaled sharply and said it might constitute criminal stalking. Meanwhile, the county's criminal case against Margaret accelerated. The audit revealed that nearly $500,000 in HOA funds had been laundered through shell accounts linked to her husband's contracting business. The evidence was overwhelming, but Reed's strategy was clear: stall, distract, and discredit. He filed motion after motion, delaying hearings while continuing his public relations offensive. The effect was corrosive. By the time the grand jury convened, the community was divided again. Some residents openly accused Jaden of destroying their neighborhood's reputation, insisting that if he had just ignored the Campfire complaint, none of this would have happened. Others supported him quietly but avoided open confrontation. Pine Hollow had become a mirror of the wider world, a place where truth had to compete with noise. The day of the hearing arrived on a gray, windless morning. Jaden sat in the courtroom beside Perez and Leah, their faces set in the expression of people who had seen too much. Margaret entered, flanked by her lawyer, her posture still regal despite the tension etched into her features. When the judge asked if she understood the charges, she replied with practiced indignation, claiming persecution. Reed delivered a smooth, rehearsed argument about overreach and vendettas, painting his client as a scapegoat for bureaucratic failure. But as the prosecution presented its evidence, emails, bank records, testimony from contractors, Margaret's mask began to slip. The documents spoke for themselves. False invoices, forged signatures, and a paper trail that led straight to her personal account. When Perez took the stand and described the state of the hydrants, the silent courtroom seemed to absorb her words like oxygen before a spark. The judge called for recess, but the verdict was already forming in the air. Outside the courthouse, chaos awaited. Protesters, some from Pine Hollow, others drawn by the media frenzy, argued in clusters. Placards read, "Save our homes," and "No justice for Jaden." The absurd duality of it all left him speechless. Leah tried to pull him toward her car, but before they reached it, Margaret herself emerged from the courthouse surrounded by reporters. Cameras flashed as she turned directly toward Jaden. Her voice trembled with anger and self-righteousness. "You did this to me," she shouted, her words echoing off the marble steps. "You destroyed this community." For a moment, everything stopped. The noise, the crowd, even the wind. And Jaden saw not a villain, but a woman consumed by the fire of her own lies, unable to separate her identity from her power. He didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. That night, Pine Hollow was cloaked in silence once again. The streets were empty, the houses dark. Yet Jaden couldn't sleep. He sat on his porch, staring at the fire pit where it had all begun. The ashes inside were faintly damp from a recent drizzle, but when the wind shifted, he could still smell the ghost of smoke. It struck him that the fire hadn't truly gone out. It had just moved, spreading through every life it touched, reshaping the landscape of the town. Somewhere down the street, a door slammed, followed by the faint hum of an engine. Maybe it was a late-night drive, or maybe someone still watching him. He didn't care anymore. The truth was out, and whatever came next would burn or cleanse, but it would not hide. The second escalation had ended not with flames, but with revelation, and in its wake, Pine Hollow no longer belonged to Margaret Waters. It belonged to the reckoning she had tried so hard to prevent. The trial that was supposed to last weeks ended in a single, devastating day. By the time the court reconvened, the evidence had become an avalanche too heavy for even Thomas Reed's smooth rhetoric to deflect. The prosecutor laid out the financial records one by one, the paper trails stretching across a decade, each document a brick in the fortress of deceit that Margaret had built around herself. The courtroom was packed with reporters, residents, and county officials, all drawn to witness the final act of a story that had begun with one small fire and ended with a conflagration of truth. Jaden sat in the back row, silent, his hands clasped in his lap as he listened to the charges read aloud. Embezzlement, fraud, obstruction of justice, falsification of public documents. Margaret's voice, when she finally spoke, trembled with the arrogance of a person who still couldn't believe the world had stopped revolving around her. She called it a witch hunt, accused everyone from the fire marshal to the judge of collusion, and when the jury foreman stood to announce the verdict, she laughed, a brittle, cracking sound that echoed across the silent room. Guilty on all counts. There was no applause, no gasp of triumph, just a long, heavy quiet that settled over the crowd like smoke after a fire. Reed gathered his papers in stiff silence while Margaret was led away, still shouting that she had been betrayed. Jaden watched her go without satisfaction. He had imagined this moment once, had thought it might bring him peace, but instead he felt hollow, as if some essential part of him had been stripped away in the process. Justice had been done. Yes, but it had come at a cost measured not only in money or reputation, but in the very soul of the community. Pine Hollow would bear scars for years, and he wondered if anyone would ever truly forgive or forget. Outside, the air was cool and clear, the sky sharp with autumn light. The reporters swarmed him the moment he stepped out of the courthouse, their questions overlapping in a blur of noise. He said nothing, pushing through the crowd until he reached the quiet street beyond. The sound of their voices faded behind him, replaced by the faint rustle of leaves and the hum of distant traffic. Perez caught up with him a few minutes later, her expression softer than he'd ever seen it. "It's over," she said quietly, as if trying to convince both of them. Jaden nodded, but he wasn't sure he believed it. Over was a word that meant closure, and nothing about Pine Hollow felt closed. When he returned home that evening, the neighborhood looked eerily still. Many houses were for sale now, the lawns neglected, the once pristine fences dulled by months of tension. The HOA office stood empty, its windows boarded. A fading notice from the county taped to the door warning of pending restructuring. He walked past it slowly, remembering the endless letters Margaret had sent him, the threats, the fines, the hollow. Promises of order and community. It all seemed absurd now, a monument to vanity and fear. At the end of the cul-de-sac, someone had placed a hand-painted sign that read, "No more HOA." Beneath it, in smaller letters, another resident had written, "Let us start over." That night, the residents gathered at Jaden's house for the first time without rules, without agendas, just people trying to breathe again. He hadn't planned it. They had simply shown up, bringing chairs, lanterns, and old bottles of wine. The fire pit glowed faintly, a circle of orange light cutting through the darkness. Perez came too, off duty now, her uniform replaced by a simple jacket, her eyes weary but kind. Someone brought a guitar, and another neighbor lit sparklers for the children. Laughter, tentative at first, began to ripple through the group, fragile but real. Jaden sat quietly, watching the fire's reflection dance in their faces. The flames crackled softly, echoing the night when all of this had begun, though now there was no anger in the air, only a kind of cautious relief. He thought about Margaret, sitting alone in a holding cell somewhere, still convinced that she was the victim. He didn't hate her anymore. He pitied her, a woman so consumed by the illusion of control that she had destroyed everything she claimed to protect. The fire she had feared had never been the threat. It had been the mirror, revealing what lay beneath the veneer of order. Jaden realized with a quiet certainty that Pine Hollow had needed to burn, metaphorically at least, to see itself clearly again. The fines, the trials, the headlines, all of it was just the necessary purging of rot that had festered for too long. As the evening deepened, someone raised a toast to new beginnings. Glasses clinked, laughter spread, and for a fleeting moment, the world felt right again. Jaden looked around at the faces illuminated by the fire. People who had once treated him like an intruder, but now smiled with genuine gratitude. He didn't need their thanks. What mattered was that they had learned, maybe the hard way, that community was not built on fear or control, but on accountability and care. When the flames finally began to die, he added one last log, watching it catch slowly, the embers glowing brighter before fading into calm. Later, long after everyone had gone, he stayed outside, alone. The stars were sharp above him, and the silence of Pine Hollow felt different now, less like the tense quiet before a storm and more like the peace that comes after one. He took a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs, and for the first time since that night months ago, he felt no weight pressing on his chest. The fire had burned itself out, but its light remained, reflected in the renewed spirit of the place he had once doubted he could call home. And as he looked toward the darkened street, he knew that whatever scars remained, they were the kind that marked survival, not defeat. Months passed before Pine Hollow began to resemble a neighborhood again. The air of fear and hostility that had once choked its streets slowly gave way to something quieter, humbler, almost tender. The lawns that had gone wild were tended again. Fences were mended, and laughter returned in small, cautious doses. There was no longer a board, no rigid list of regulations dictating what color mailboxes could be or how tall the grass was allowed to grow. Instead, the residents met once a month in the park under the old oak tree to discuss real matters. Repairs, safety, community events, without titles, without hierarchy. Jaden never volunteered to lead anything, though people still turned to him instinctively when disagreements arose. He'd learned enough about power to know that it was safest when shared. Leah's second documentary about Pine Hollow aired in the spring. It wasn't a scandal piece this time, but a quiet portrait of recovery, showing the same streets that had once symbolized corruption, now filled with life again. The camera lingered on the repaired fire hydrants, the reopened clubhouse, the community garden Jaden helped design where the HOA's office used to stand. He watched the premiere alone, the screen's glow flickering across his face, and when his name appeared in the credits under the title Consultant, he turned the volume down and smiled faintly. It was never fame he wanted, only truth, and now truth had a strange stillness to it, like the air after a storm. Margaret remained in county jail awaiting sentencing. Occasionally her name appeared in short news updates, but most people stopped paying attention. Her house was sold to a young couple who planted wildflowers along the fence, covering the soil that had once marked her domain. The past was still there, buried under new growth, but it no longer held power. Jaden sometimes walked past it on his evening strolls, his dog trotting ahead, and he would catch himself thinking that even ruin, given time, could turn into something fertile. On the first anniversary of the fire that started it all, the neighborhood held a small gathering in his yard. There was no ceremony, no speeches, just neighbors sharing food, children chasing one another, and a single flame flickering in the fire pit as dusk settled. Perez came, off duty, bringing homemade pie, and Leah showed up with her camera, but didn't film anything. "Some stories don't need another ending," she said softly, watching the sparks rise into the darkening sky. Jaden nodded, understanding more than he could put into words. The flames reflected in the faces around him, warm and alive, but this time they were not symbols of conflict. They were reminders of endurance, of how fragile order could be, and how resilient people could become when forced to face themselves. When the last of the guests left and the night deepened, Jaden stayed by the fire until it burned low. The scent of smoke drifted upward, clean and familiar. He thought about everything that had happened, the fear, the anger, the revelations, and realized it no longer felt like a story about destruction. It was a story about renewal disguised as disaster. Pine Hollow had been broken open, but from the fractures, light had entered. He smiled to himself, stirred the coals one last time, and whispered a quiet goodbye to the ghosts of the past. The embers glowed a final moment before dimming to ash, leaving behind only peace and the soft, rhythmic sound of the wind moving gently through the trees.